Hi, welcome to my Parsha Shir. Today we are going to talk about Parshas Re'eh. Thank you so much to my dear friend Susan Grayson, who is sponsoring today's Shir in memory of her late husband William Grayson, Be'el ben Moshe Zechonu Livracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 25th of Av. May his neshama have an aliyah. May we all be zocher to see tchias hamesim. We live in an age where tolerance and compassion have become the ultimate buzzwords. Almost nothing is beyond the pale, and if you turn up your nose at anything, or even have any kind of thought that something is worthy of criticism, then you are the problem. Every progressive manifesto, every woke slogan, every liberal campaign insists that the highest virtue is to be open to anything and everything. There can be no judgment, no boundaries, and definitely no limits. Although, I think I need to say that this supposed openness is actually nothing of the sort. It's not really libertarianism. Instead, it's a woke religion. Scratch the surface, that's all, just the surface, and you'll discover that the very people who preach tolerance the loudest are often the most intolerant of all. If you disagree with them, if you dare to disagree with them, even slightly, then you must be a bigot, or a fascist, or a racist, or a terrible human being, or worse. The woke faithful's compassion only extends to those who think and act exactly as they do. But my main point is this: even when this woke progressive brand of so-called compassion looks generous, it often ends up being the opposite of generous. The great writer C.S. Lewis understood this danger and wrote about it. He called it the tyranny of the omnipotent moral busybody. He meant those people who tell you, we're only doing this for your own good, while they strip you of your freedom and impose their ideology on your life. Lewis warned that this is the worst kind of oppression, worse than the tyrant motivated by greed or power, because the busybody is driven by self-righteous conviction. He never rests, he never feels guilty, and he never stops, because in his mind, or her mind, everything that they do is an act of compassion. But in the end, it's always tyranny. History proves this point in the most brutal way. Rousseau and Marx dreamed of a world where all were equal, where oppression was abolished, and where compassion and tolerance would reign. Their vision inspired the violent and sprawling Russian Revolution of 1917, an uprising that was clothed in the language of justice and equality. But that dream very quickly became a nightmare. By the time Lenin and Stalin were finished reshaping society in the name of compassion for the downtrodden worker, tens of millions had been executed, starved, or shipped off to the Gulag. The Soviet Union and its communist satellites became the most authoritarian, intolerant regime in human history. Dissent was impossible, suspicion was everywhere, and one wrong opinion could cost you your job, your freedom, or your life. The revolution that promised tolerance and inclusion delivered terror and exclusion on a scale that was never seen before. And of course, the French Revolution set the template a century earlier. They promised liberty, equality, fraternity, compassion and tolerance for every man and woman. Liberty, equality, fraternity, these are three words that sound wonderful. The revolutionaries promised compassion for the poor, justice for the oppressed, dignity for every man and woman. But what did it actually deliver? The guillotine. A river of blood flowed through Paris as one group after another was condemned in the name of equality. Neighbours informed on neighbours, priests and nobles were butchered, and finally the very revolutionaries themselves were devoured by their own monster. The reign of terror was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of unbounded compassion turned into ideology, mercy stripped of discipline, tolerance without limits. And after the dust settled, France didn't end up with utopia, it ended up with Napoleon, an emperor who crowned himself king of Europe. The lesson? Compassion without boundaries doesn't create a kinder society. It just paves the way for tyranny in a new costume. Or consider Weimar Germany, that strange interlude between the collapse of the Kaiserreich and the rise of Hitler. The Weimar years were full of elevated talk about democracy, openness, and tolerance. Anything went. Berlin was awash with cabarets, experimental art, libertarian materialism, and a political culture so open that nothing could hold together. Everyone was tolerated. Communists, fascists, anarchists, monarchists, until the very idea of tolerance collapsed under the weight of chaos. Street battles raged between rival gangs. Inflation shredded people's savings, and the very people who thought that endless openness was the essence of modernity discovered that all they had built was a vacuum. And guess who stepped into that vacuum? Adolf Hitler. He offered certainty instead of tolerance, and order instead of compassion. The irony is brutal. Weimar's permissiveness created the hunger for authoritarianism. A society without boundaries is not free. It is only waiting for the strong man who promises to impose boundaries again. And modern iterations of this warped idealism follow the same script. It's always couched in humanitarian terms. Tolerance, inclusion, equality, but they end up doing the opposite. New castes are created that are not based on class, but on ideology. And if you fall into the wrong group, say you don't hold the approved political opinions, then you are excluded, you're censored, or cancelled. Compassion has been weaponized to justify cruelty. I'll give you some examples. We see it in policies on drug addiction. Do you know what they do? They hand out free needles and subsidized narcotics. It's not to heal people, because no one who gets free needles and drugs is cured of drug addiction. But the people who do it can look compassionate, while at the same time they keep the addicts trapped in misery. We also see it in crime, where prosecutors refuse to press charges in the name of equity. But guess what? As a result, it leaves whole neighborhoods unsafe. And we see it in education, where discipline and standards are now denounced as oppressive, leaving classrooms in chaos. Most starkly, we see it in the tolerance of woke extremism. Nutty progressive ideologies are accepted and even celebrated in the name of freedom until they finally explode and cause real harm. What passes for compassion and tolerance ends up fueling exactly the destruction it claims to prevent. This hypocrisy has become the defining feature of so-called tolerant progressivism. On college campuses, students chant about openness and free speech, but the moment an invited speaker says something they don't like, the event is shouted down, cancelled, or stormed by protesters. It turns out that free speech is only free if you agree with a dominant ideology, the one that shouts the loudest. Tolerance extends only as far as the approved narrative. Anyone who deviates, even slightly, from the approved narrative is hounded, is smeared, and is excommunicated from polite society. We've seen professors lose their jobs for using the wrong pronoun. Journalists are fired for asking inconvenient questions. Comedians are blacklisted for daring to mock the sacred cows of progressive orthodoxy. Although progressive professors and students can say whatever they like, whenever they like, and to whomever they like about woke talking points, and it is never considered offensive. Even if it is, they never get thrown out and they never get into trouble. That's the irony. The progressive call for compassion and inclusion has not created a kinder, gentler society, but rather a society of fear and intimidation, where everyone who isn't part of the woke mob is walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing. And inevitably, this phony tolerance provokes a reaction. Some people just get tired of being bullied by self-appointed moral arbiters and the result is a pendulum swing toward extremism on the other side. What was meant to create harmony instead breeds division, resentment, and polarization. The self-righteous intolerance of the left fuels the very backlash it so righteously claims to oppose. This is the greatest irony of all. Compassion without boundaries, tolerance without discernment, doesn't just fail, it actively causes harm. It is not merciful to excuse destructive behavior, and it is not compassionate to normalize dysfunction. When, quote, anything goes, eventually everything collapses. We see this in the most obvious way with progressive extremism. Under the banner of cultural sensitivity, Western governments and universities excuse violent rhetoric and justify terrorism as resistance. But what begins as tolerance for words quickly becomes tolerance for violence. The progressive left that prides itself on inclusivity suddenly finds itself defending the most exclusivist, intolerant ideologies on earth. In the end, the victims of this tolerance are always the innocent. Ordinary folk, vulnerable communities, or in our own case, the Jewish people. Don't be surprised by what I'm about to tell you, but the Torah spotted this danger thousands of years ago. It's in Parshas Re'eh, which offers us a simple reminder that misplaced consideration and loyalty to values that are wrong is never virtue, it's always vice. Whether it's a false prophet, as we shall see, or the family member who whispers bad things in your ear, or the city that suddenly fully embraces the faddish beliefs. None of these things are met by the Torah with understanding or empathy. Absolutely not. They are met with decisive rejection. The Torah commands us, lo tachmol velo techaseh alav. Do not pity them and do not cover for them. Why? Because a society that cannot draw healthy moral boundaries and a society that cannot say no will not survive and cannot survive. What appears merciful in the moment is in reality cruelty in the long run. True compassion is not the indulgence of destructive forces. It is the protection of what is good so that good prevails. The Torah is not naive about human emotions. It knows that when someone close to you, someone close to us, urges us towards a destructive path, our instinct is to feel connected to them and to do what they are telling us. After all, the family member who entices you to idolatry in Parshas Re'eh is not a stranger. The verse is very specific. Ki yasitcha achicha ben imecha, o bincha, o bitecha, o ishes chekecha, o re'echa asher kenafshecha. If your brother, your son, your daughter, the wife of your dearest friend, or your closest friend tries to entice you, these are the people you love most, the people you have a close relationship with, and they are the very last ones you'd want to condemn or reject. And yet the Torah insists, lo tov velo tishma alav, velo techaseh alav, velo tachmol, velo techaseh alav. Do not give in to him or listen to him. Do not pity him. Do not have compassion, and do not cover for him. Why does the Torah insist on such a harsh response? It's exactly because misplaced compassion and allowing your emotions to overcome your rational faculties corrodes the foundations of a community. A prophet who leads people astray, or a loved one who whispers sedition in your ear, is not just making a private mistake of no consequence. They are planting a virulent cancer that spreads. To tolerate them out of misplaced bonds or because they have couched their ideas in something that tugs at your heartstrings is to sacrifice the entire body for the sake of a cancerous tumor. This is exactly how the Rambam explains it in his Hilchos Avodah Zarah. Chapter 5, he writes that idolatry is unlike any other sin because it's not simply a personal failing. It undermines the covenant that binds Israel to God. And loyalty to and compassion for anything that God doesn't want is avodah zarah. It's idolatry. Allowing it to spread in the name of kind-heartedness is like refusing to amputate a gangrenous limb because you feel sorry for it. In the end, you doom the entire body. In Rambam's words, compassion in this context is not a virtue, but a betrayal. Rav Hirsch takes the idea even further. The Torah could have issued a single prohibition and moved on. It could simply have said, don't listen to him. Instead, the Torah unleashes a cascade of commands. You've heard them. Lo velo, velo alav, velo techaseh alav, velo tachmol, velo techaseh alav. Don't consent, don't listen, don't pity, don't have compassion, don't cover for him. Why such overkill? Why hammer the point so hard, so much? The answer is so logical. Because the Torah knows the human heart. When it is your brother or your wife or your closest friend or someone you admire whispering poison into your ear, the pull of misplaced affection or compassion or loyalty is almost irresistible. So the Torah anticipates every excuse and every rationalization and blocks them all one by one. Rav Hirsch explains that the very redundancy of all these instructions is the point. Each don't targets another layer of our instinct to excuse the wrong, but attractive in the name of compassion. The repetition is God's way of training us in emotional discipline. True mercy cannot mean indulging ourselves in something that will ultimately destroy us and everything that should be truly valued. That's what's going to happen. This is the Torah's great insight. Compassion must be principled. Mercy has limits, because without limits, mercy destroys. The Torah is full of instructions and warnings to love and care for the stranger, and to care for the orphan, and to feed the hungry, and to rescue the oppressed. But it is equally clear that compassion must never extend to those who would dismantle the moral core of society. If everything we do is purely driven by emotion and feelings, in the end we lose everything. It even applies to the concept of tzedakah. This week's parsha tells us about tzedakah. But we are not allowed to give everything away and be left with nothing, even if the needs of the poor are great. We are only expected to give a proportion of what we have, up to a fifth, but no more. But what about the needs of the suffering poor? In the end, we need to let go and say it's God's world and He will take care of the poor and needy. Or He won't, at least in our understanding. And that is how the world is. That's God's world. The Torah is not anti-compassion. It is anti-unprincipled and uncontrolled compassion. That's the key. In Parshas Re'eh, the Torah identifies the most emotionally challenging cases: the Novi Sheker, the false prophet, and the Masis, the influencer, who is your brother, your mentor, your friend. These are the people you most want to listen to. Or, if you are slightly uncomfortable with what they are saying, at least, the very least, you'd want to excuse them. But the Torah emphatically says, don't. Chazal say this out loud with terrifying clarity. Hamarachim al ha'achzorim, soifoi lahachzor al harachmonim. If you are merciful to the cruel, you'll end up being cruel to the merciful. Think about the story of Shaul and Agag, king of Amalek. Vayachmel Shaul. Shaul had pity, and the result was a moral catastrophe that cost him the crown and resulted in the decree generated by Haman generations later in Persia under Achashverosh. The Torah's no isn't a lack of heart, it's a refusal to let misplaced heart break the body. Greek philosophy covers this same ground. Aristotle said it plainly. Compassion, elios, is a virtue, he says, but only when governed by phronesis, practical wisdom. In his Nicomachean ethics, he insists that virtue never lies in unbounded feeling, but in the mesotes, the space between extremes. This is a theme that the Rambam also adopted. Too little compassion hardens into cruelty, but too much compassion, boundless mercy, is not the answer. It is just another extreme and therefore a vice. Aristotle even gives examples. He says the man who forgives every wrong, who excuses every crime, he says, is not virtuous but foolish because he abandons justice in the name of sentiment. The Stoics took this even further. Seneca, in his De Clementia, written as advice to the young Emperor Nero, if only he'd taken it, draws a sharp line between true clemency and weak indulgence. He tells us that clemency is the restraint of power guided by reason and justice, but indulgence, pardoning without judgment, excusing without principle, is not clemency at all. It is cowardice disguised as kindness. To spare the guilty, he warns, is to harm the innocent. In other words, misplaced compassion does not eliminate injustice, it multiplies it because it abandons the victims to the whims of the cruel. Modern psychology actually backs this up. Jonathan Haidt, a well-known social psychologist, explains that when a culture makes compassion its only guiding principle and pushes aside other values like fairness, loyalty, respect for authority, or a sense of the sacred, things get skewed. What you end up with is what he calls compassion monism, a society where feelings matter more than facts and good intentions matter more than actual outcomes. Psychologists have actually shown how this works in real life. Paul Bloom, in his book Against Empathy, argues that gut-level empathy often leads to biased, short-sighted decision. It feels compassionate in the moment, but the long-term effects can be destructive. Take the global Free Palestine movement. For many, the instinct is emotional. Look at the suffering, feel their pain, rally for their cause. On the surface, that feels merciful, but it's empathy without wisdom. It ignores the brutality of Hamas, the way its leaders exploit civilians by putting them in harm's way. And targeting Israel and threatening Israel doesn't liberate Palestinians, it only makes things worse for them, strengthens their oppressors. The real tragedy is that all the people chanting Free Palestine have not freed a single Palestinian or made the life of one Palestinian better. If anything, these woke virtue signalers have helped entrench Hamas's grip on Gaza and prolonging the cycle of violence and misery. What looks like compassion, and probably is motivated, at least in part, by compassion, has only made life worse for the very people those protesters claim they want to help. At the family level, developmental psychologists Diane Baumrin's classic research on parenting styles found that the permissive, in other words, the let everything slide model, correlates with poorer outcomes. The healthiest kids emerge from authoritative homes that balance love with boundaries, warm and firm. In public policy, the so-called broken windows concept makes the same point. If you tolerate small disorder, you will inevitably experience large disorder. Some people might question particular applications of this idea, but the underlying wisdom is hard to ignore. You can't argue with it. Boundaries protect the vulnerable, and when boundaries are eroded, the entire structure becomes fragile. That is why those who argue for dismantling long-standing norms in the name of progress or compassion must be treated with suspicion. History has shown time and again that agitators who present themselves as visionaries or reformers are often mesis umediach people. They're just in disguise. They are seducers and inciters who lead people astray under the banner of justice or equality. Today we call them influencers and political activists, but their role is the same as a mesis umediach, to undermine the hard-won safeguards of civilization by convincing us that our walls are oppressive, our traditions are outdated, and our moral compass is irrelevant. Once those protective boundaries are breached, what follows is not liberation, but chaos. It is a terrible mistake to listen to these voices. What they dress up as compassion or progress is often nothing more than a wrecking ball, aimed at undermining the very foundations of society. Our own Masorah, our tradition, says it beautifully in 3 words. In Pirkei Avos, the Mishnah tells us, Aseh siog la Torah, build fences around the Torah. We don't do that to make life miserable, but to make life livable. The beloved American poet Robert Frost put it beautifully. Good fences make good neighbors. Chazal also tell us, Habo lehargecha, hashkem leharga. If someone is on his way to kill you, rise up first to stop him and kill him. We don't believe in turning the other cheek. The Torah refuses to let niceness lead to disaster for those who uphold God's word. Even the poetry of Tehillim encodes this balance. Chesed ve'emes nifgoshu, tzedek ve'shalom nashaku. Chesed, kindness, must meet emes, truth. Tzedek, justice, must kiss shalom, peace. It's all choreography, love and truth, justice and peace. Each of them creates havoc and chaos when they go solo, but if you find the balance, if they are dancing with each other, if they are in an embrace, then you're onto a winner. Sefer HaChinuch explains the roots of the mitzvah of not tolerating bad people who give bad advice on how your life should be run. It's about preserving emunah, preserving faith, which is a communal survival need. Bad ideas don't float harmlessly. They form people and change society. The mesis, the mediach weaponize intimacy to corrode the covenant. That's why the Torah suspends even the usual protections for the perpetrator, because here, in this situation, speed in dealing with it is compassion. The longer you tolerate them and allow them to flourish, the more souls you lose. The Chasam Sofer comments on the Torah's harsh rejection of the mesis. He explains that misplaced compassion isn't mercy at all. It is betrayal. To pity the seducer who leads Jews astray is to abandon the victims whose soul he corrupts. The Meshech Chochmah sharpens this even more. The Torah doesn't say, don't hate him or don't be cruel. It says, don't have rachmanos. Why? Because rachmanos, pity, mercy, compassion, is the very thing that clouds judgment. Left unchecked, it erodes the covenant, it dismantles the community, it makes survival impossible. Sometimes the hardest mitzvah is to deny your heart in the moment so that Am Yisrael and truth itself can live on. And here's a story for you. A seasoned emergency room nurse once told me, you know the hardest thing I learned as a nurse? That not every comforting thing helps a patient. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to cause pain now, reset the bone, drain the abscess so that they can heal. The nurse told me she had to stop confusing her need to feel kind with their need to get better. That's what we've been talking about. The short, sharp tachmol is the painful reset that saves the limb. And if you want an earthy proverb from our own backyard, chesed she'ein bo din eino chesed. A kindness with no judgment isn't kindness at all. The flip side is equally true. Din she'ein bo chesed eino din. Judgment with no kindness isn't justice. The Torah asks for us to weave them together and to get the balance right. So where does this leave us? With principled compassion, not the mush of openness to anything and everything, but the courage to love with boundaries. Love the stranger, v'ahavtem es hager, feed the hungry, rescue the oppressed, and, at the very same time, protect the covenant by saying no to the forces that would hollow it out. That's Moshe's entire project in Parshas Re'eh. See clearly, choose boldly, and don't let sentimentality dress up as virtue. In a culture that worships feelings, Re'eh demands vision. Re'eh, noisin lifnechem hayom bracha uklala. Choices are real, consequences are real, mercy is real too, but only when it travels hand in hand with truth. Otherwise, as Chazal warned, mercy for the cruel becomes cruelty to the merciful, and that's not compassion. That's collapse. So where does it leave us? It leaves us with a choice. The same choice Moshe put before us at the beginning of Parshas Re'eh, as I've said. See, I place before you today the blessing and the curse. The blessing comes when compassion is going to be hand in hand with truth. It comes when mercy knows its limit. It comes when boundaries protect what is sacred. The curse comes when compassion turns into indulgence. It comes when tolerance erases all standards. It comes when mercy is extended to the cruel at the expense of the merciful. The Torah's voice is not cold or unfeeling. It is the voice of principled compassion, of the kind of mercy that is disciplined by wisdom. And that's exactly the voice we need in our age of woke activism and influencer tyrants, the ones who call destruction justice and chaos progress. The Torah tells us clearly, don't listen to them, don't pity them, don't indulge them, build fences around the truth, because only then will your compassion be real, and only then your mercy will heal, and only then can society endure and thrive. I think I've given you plenty to think about in today's shir, so let's leave it here for now. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.